Ladies and gentlemen, Kemenq Learning Week Day 4 is about to begin. But before that, let me take a moment to review a few technical details. Today's webinar will be conducted in English. However, it comes with English-Indonesian subtitle. To pop up the subtitle, click the three dots icon on the right below, choose Caption, enable translation, and choose the caption language, either in English or Indonesian. This webinar is also available on our YouTube channel. That's all the information. Let us now begin the Kemenq Learning Week Day 4, Economic Resilience, How Global Trade and Cooperation Influence Each Other. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to Learning Week Day 4, Economic Resilience, How Global Trade and Cooperation Influence Each Other. First of all, I would like to thank God the Almighty that has given us blessings to virtually attend this webinar. And I would like to extend a very warm welcome to the Head of Financial Education and Training Agency, Bapak Andin Hadianto, Director of Center for Regional and Bilateral Policy, Ibu Yogi Rahmayanti, our special guest speaker, Professor Corey M. Crabb, and our moderator, Bapak Ozi Diva Ersyah. My name is Dea Rizky Amanda Panjaitan, and I am honored to be the Master of Ceremony at this event. Today is the last day of Kemenq Learning Week 2025. On behalf of the organizing committee, we extend our appreciation for each and every one of you. We are very grateful for the enthusiasm of participants ever since the day one of Kemenq Learning Week. Best regards to all participants who have joined us today. I am very pleased to announce that we have hundreds of participants who are joining this event via Zoom and YouTube at the moment. Dear participants, to officially start this webinar, we are pleased to listen to the keynote speech from Director of Center for Regional and Bilateral Policy, Ibu Yogi Rahmayanti. Ibu Yogi, we are kindly invite you to begin.
Terima kasih. Baik, thank you very much. Selamat pagi. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Very good morning to all of us. First of all, distinguished Professor Corey Crabb. Very nice to meet you, although it's just on screen, yeah. Yes, professor from the practice of public policy and also the director of the graduate studies of Master of International Development Policy, Sanford School of Public Policy, Duke University. And also to all of you participants of this Indonesian Finance Ministry Learning Week. So this is really a great pleasure and honor that I could attend today's session, especially, and also thank you for choosing this topic, this very, I hope, interesting and exciting topic because of today's situation in the global landscape. I believe we are all enthusiastic to be here today to discuss this topic of economic resilience, how global trade and cooperation influence each other. So a little bit introduction, maybe adding more detail to what the MC already introduced us. So we are here in the regional and bilateral policy, deals with diplomacy, basically in the realm of finance and economic, but also especially we are involved in the trade agreement. And so this topic is really our interest, yeah, best interest. So ladies and gentlemen, we are at the crucial juncture now in the cross-border trade, heavily influenced by, we all know the recent tariff policies of Trump 2.0 era. So I recalled the incidents of the so-called Liberation Day at that time. So Indonesia at that time was we are in the middle of a very long holiday of Eid holiday, and so anticipating the Liberation Day, we could not have. We could not enjoy actually the holiday, and then right after that, we also have ASEAN finance minister meeting. That so everybody was really drawn into that really big topic. So I just want to recall that. So and now I think we had many milestones, yeah, and also with Indonesia's negotiation with the US. Also, we started early, but now I think we are in the still like in the process and not knowing really the end of or the result of that negotiation. So international trade, once a hallmark of globalization, now we are facing significant challenges from shifting geopolitical alliances, supply chain disruptions, and the demand for greater economic resilience. As we confront rising protectionism, ongoing trade wars, and the effect of the pandemic, we actually now have a unique opportunity to reshape trade to be more sustainable, equitable, and secure for the future. I cannot emphasize more on this, that we cannot lose the momentum here to actually correct the whatever we have, including the imbalance and I think the imperfection, yeah, of this globalization that we have, so that we in the future we have more sustainable uh, global trade and globalization. The global trade is vital for economic resilience, providing access to diverse markets and resources. The COVID-19 pandemic emphasized a lesson learned, the importance of robust trade networks. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development reported in March 2025 that global trade reached 33 trillion US dollar, up 3.7% from 2023, driven by developing economies and strong services trade, but facing risks from trade imbalances and geopolitical tensions. In the most recent OECD report, they also warned that supply chain localization could decrease actually the global trade by more than 18% and global real GDP by more than 5%, with no consistent improvement in resilience actually. On the other hand, international cooperation enables trade agreements that lower barriers and promote fair practices. The World Trade Organization, for example, provides vital platforms for negotiation and dispute resolution, ensuring global market stability. We have seen the impact of cooperation during events like the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. A lack of cooperation can lead to increased tensions, while unified efforts will help us prepare for disruptions and stimulate recovery faster. Ladies and gentlemen, effective trade agreements are not merely contractual obligations. They are the bedrock of collaboration that ensures adherence to rules and resolutions of disputes. Such cooperation fosters an open and resilient trading environment. It's essential for navigating complexities of our interconnected world. The WTO highlights that cooperation creates a stable framework that strengthens our resilience. The IMF also points out that collaboration in trade restores trust in global system, while OECD also emphasizes the importance of open markets and resilient supply chains for innovation. In the case of Indonesia, we stand at the strategic crossroads of global trade, both geographically and economically. As Southeast Asia's largest economy and a key member of the G20, Indonesia has taken active steps to integrate more deeply into the global and regional trade system. Through various strategic free trade agreements and comprehensive economic partnership agreements, such as we have now Indonesia, Australia, CEPA, ASEAN China FTA, Indonesia Canada CEPA, and ASEAN Plus FTA, and also the regional comprehensive economic partnership RCEP, yeah, probably the biggest economic partnerships. We are tightly weaving our economic fabric into global tapestry. To maximize the potential of these agreements and ensure economic resilience, Indonesia is committed to strengthening regional cooperation. Our focus extends beyond exchanges of goods and services. We are also prioritizing comprehensive economic cooperation through the liberalization of financial services, the development of capital markets, and the liberalization of capital accounts. In addition, we are pursuing more comprehensive agreements under framework of CEPA, moving beyond traditional FTA and investment treaties. So aside from that, Indonesia, I think we also really realize or believe the importance of also improving our domestic resilience. So the president has been really emphasizing that we have to move faster on the structural reforms by streamlining the procedures, even revisiting some of the policies such as the local content requirements, not only in response to the US tariff and also USTR concerns of Indonesia for our non-trade barriers, but it is really coming from our own domestic agenda as well. So it's aligned. What all of this illustrates is a clear and decisive direction that Indonesia is not retreating from global trade challenges. Rather, we are actively together reshaping it. By pursuing strategic agreements and fostering regional alliances, Indonesia is laying the groundwork for a more resilient, competitive, and inclusive trade for a more future economic resilience. Ladies and gentlemen, the economic landscape we navigate is increasingly influenced by a complex web of challenges, which not only fragments the global trade, but also hinders the advancement of vital sectors, including clean energy and technology. I would like to commend Indonesia for its proactive stance against these turbulent times. Our nation has reaffirmed ASEAN's commitment to refrain from imposing retaliatory measures in response to US tariffs. Instead, we are dedicated to pursuing constructive dialogues and forging win-win solutions. However, it is also imperative that Indonesia, as a country and an integral part of Southeast Asia, collaborates closely with strategic partners. Together, we must also focus on enhancing multilateral cooperation, modernizing trade agreements to encompass digital trade and sustainability, and ensuring that our trade policy bolsters economic resilience. I remember once again, during the ASEAN, I think one really clear message from everybody that really we want to integrate more, or we want to increase regional trade within ASEAN and also ASEAN plus 3 region. As we gather here today, I invite you to delve deeper into the current state of global trade and international cooperation. We could examine how these two dynamics influence each other, identify the driving forces behind these changes, evaluate who bears the brunt of the impact, and contemplate the direction in which we are heading. Our aim should be to harness both global and regional momentum to catalyze economic growth and resilience. I sincerely hope this session will foster fruitful and engaging discussions. We are privileged to learn from experts like Professor Pori today, whose insights could be invaluable in shaping Indonesian economic policy within the realm of international trade and cooperation. With that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to our upcoming conversation today. Thank you so much. Back to you.
Thank you, Ibu Yogi, for the keynote speech and for taking the time with us today. We understand that you may have other commitments, so please don't hesitate to leave the session whenever you need to. And once again, we sincerely appreciate your presence with us today. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, now is the time for the main event that we have been waiting for. Let me introduce the moderator for today's webinar, Bapak Ozi Diva Ersya. Bapak Ozi is the head of Free Trade Agreement Affairs Section 4 at the Directorate General of Customs and Excise, Ministry of Finance, with a PhD in International Economic Law from the University of Nottingham. His research focused on the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement in Indonesia. He also holds an ALM from VU University, Amsterdam, and a bachelor's in economics from the University of Mercu Buana. Over 2 decades of experience in customs and trade, Pak Ozi is well versed in global trade and international cooperation. Now, we would like to invite Pak Ozi. Pak Ozi, you may take over the screen now.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Dea. It is an honor for me to be here, and I would like to welcome our honorable guests and audiences who have joined us today. Thank you for joining us. Before we start, I would like to make a housekeeping and announcement for our audiences. Ladies and gentlemen, if you don't mind, please keep your camera on and your microphone muted throughout the entire session. The talk will go on for about 45 minutes, followed by a 20 minutes of Q&A session. Feel free to ask your questions, and there are several ways to do that. If you're joining from Zoom, either write down your question into the Zoom chat, to which I will read them, but we encourage you to raise your hand during the Q&A session. If you're joining us through live streaming on YouTube, please write down your question into live chat. On this final day of CommunQ Learning Week 20 and 25, we will discuss a highly relevant and crucial topic: economic resilience, how global trade and cooperation influence each other, particularly about the trade changes, impact of tariffs, and economic growth. This topic will truly explore how global economic resilience can be built and strengthened through the dynamic interaction between global trade and international cooperation. We will explore various perspectives and strategies to address current and future economic challenges. Throughout the seminar, we encourage you to take notes and hold into any question you might have until the end. We will aim to answer as many questions as possible during the allocated questions and answer session. Before we begin this insightful session, allow me to introduce our distinguished speaker this morning. It is with great honor that I present Professor Corinne Krupp, Director of Graduate Studies of the Master of International Development Policy at the Sanford School, Duke University. Professor Corey possesses a remarkable record of achievement in international economics and development policy. Her expertise in analyzing the intricate relationship between global trade, cooperation, and economic resilience will undoubtedly provide valuable insights for all of us today. We are privileged to benefit from her direct expertise in cultivating economic resilience amidst the fluctuating dynamics of the global landscape. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in inviting and giving a warm welcome to Professor Corey. Please give a big applause to Professor Corey. Good evening in the US, Professor, in US time, Professor, and good morning all here for our audiences. How are you today?
I'm well. I'm very glad to be with you this morning in Tomorrowland, where you are. I'm still in yes.
Okay, it's
Thank
great
you
to
so
have
much
you
for
with us
inviting
today.
me.
Okay, without further ado, please, Professor Corey, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful introduction that your esteemed official gave, and actually she covered a lot of the things that I'm interested in talking to you about. So I'm going to pull up my slides, but I hope some of the things I will talk about are not so easy for you that you're aware of them. You're all trade people, so I hope that at least some of this is new, or at least familiar to you. So let's see. There we go. Okay. So I am a professor at Duke, as Ozzy mentioned. I teach international economics and macro policy and finance and pretty much anything we need. I direct a mid-career master's program in international development policy, and I've been very happy to see some things in the chat from some of my former students who are attending today. Had several students from Indonesia, and I'm thrilled that you're here. When I was in graduate school at Pennsylvania, I focused on trade. So trade policy, trade behavior by different countries and by firms, and the macro side, the exchange rate swings and how the international capital flows work. And so that's also been my interest in research and in teaching. All right, so it's a little bit about me. So here's what I prepared for today. And when I was asked to talk about economic resilience and trade, I thought we should start by just talking about what economic resilience is and means, and what are some of the factors that influence it. The linkages between trade and economic growth, and what either promotes resilience or impedes it, because we know trade can create volatility too. And then I wanted to do a little bit of a review on history. Some of it is just why global trade exploded the way it did and when it started to happen. A little bit about Indonesia's engagement in global value chains and some of the challenges you faced. And then talk about a few case studies and some of the empirical evidence on the trade and growth linkages. You know, what have we learned over time contributes to growth with trade, and what impedes it? And then, you know, we can't not talk about the recent tensions that have arisen with President Trump's belief that tariffs are wonderful. I don't think anyone in the US really celebrated Liberation Day as being liberated from anything. So it's a very controversial topic in the US too. But all the trade uncertainty that has arisen, how do we respond? And how should Indonesia be thinking about responding? You know, she already talked about some of those things that you're already doing that are helping, but we can talk more about them. And then finally, just what kinds of trade cooperation could help build resilience? Something all countries need to think about. So to start with, economic resilience, I think of it as just the ability to bounce back from shocks. And shocks can be positive or negative. Positive shocks are big increase in demand for your goods, or technology breakthroughs that increase productivity and enable you to produce more. Any kind of shock can create economic dislocation and change prices and change trading patterns. So the ability of the economy to weather shocks depends on the nature of them. If they were just internal shocks, the way you handle those is different than if it was coming from outside. Like if a trading partner, there's a huge change in demand for your goods, or there's a local conflict that interrupts your ability to trade, it wrecks trade routes. What influences your ability to weather shocks? And from a macro perspective, usually that has to do with the government's provision of social safety nets. So if there is a big increase in unemployment or a drop in output, how do people smooth consumption? How do they eat? So the government usually has to have built in some kind of income support or unemployment insurance, guaranteed access to healthcare and food if those supplies get disrupted, things like that. Another thing that increases your resilience is not relying on just a few trading partners. And Indonesia is well aware of this. You've diversified quite a bit and made a lot of linkages within Southeast and East Asia. But diversifying not only your trade, but your economic activities. So you're not dependent on a few commodities, for example. And then having lots of different trading partners and linkages through your trade, not just in goods, but also your services and financial flows. And then Yogi also mentioned that transparency and social trust and good governance, all those things are also important. So these are pretty obvious things. So when we talk about resilience, there's some great examples in history. I mean, COVID-19 is one of the most recent. We saw supply chains interrupted. We saw countries imposing export restraints because they're trying to protect their supplies of medical equipment and ventilators and PPEs. And so resilience came from realizing that we needed to have some domestic stockpiles of these things, but we also couldn't stop trading with each other because no country was self-sufficient. I'll just cite a few other examples. The 1970s Arab oil embargo was another case of an export restriction on oil coming to the US, and it was very sudden, and it dramatically increased prices and led to shortages. And while that was good for Indonesia because you were a big oil exporter at the time, it created so much disruption in the US that it totally changed our energy policies and led to the investments that have paid off over the decades in the US becoming an oil exporter, which we were not. So resilience often comes from the damage that's done by shocks. And, another recent example is the Russia-Ukraine war and the dependence of a lot of European countries on gas, natural gas coming from Russia. I mean, the loss of that access, the big jump in prices, the shortages, they had to scramble, but that can create resilience. So yes, shocks can have devastating short-run effects, but then they can lead to decision-making that helps build in the resilience. So I think some of the things we need to think about when we look at the link between trade and resilience is the positive side. How can trade create opportunities for adapting to shocks? And then in what way can trade make things worse? How can trade worsen the impact of shocks or transmit them across countries? And then how do we prepare for that? And then what is the impact of different kinds of trade policies like export restrictions or tariffs or subsidies or cooperative agreements on building economic resilience and adapting to shocks? So I think when we talk about shocks and their effects, there's two different timings that we need to think about. The short run focus is the immediate aftermath of a shock. And we want to focus on damage control, restoring income, making sure there's food and critical health supplies, helping to limit how much pain is being suffered, right? So that's where your income support and emergency aid is important. But in the long run, building resilience is about helping to build in the shock absorbers so that the pain from shocks is less. And it's a way of building strength in the economy, promoting growth, promoting innovation, and attracting investment so that it's almost self-insurance from shocks, right? Talk about the benefits of trade and how trade helps build resilience. These are obvious things that you all know. So we know competition promotes investment in innovation and productivity enhancements, and it spurs economic growth, as opposed to when you have a few small, when you limit competition and then you end up with monopolies that are lazy and they don't invest, right? We know even though Indonesia, for example, has a large middle class and a large market, the global market is so much bigger that having access to selling into a global market can lead to those economies of scale that let you move down the cost curve, create new products that perhaps your own people don't want to buy, but you can sell into other markets. It diversifies your demand so that if you have a domestic downturn, you can continue to sell into other markets. And trade means access to new things, ideas, management techniques, technology, new inputs that you don't make, more sophisticated inputs or different types of things. It also exposes you through the new ideas to new technologies, and that helps you increase you build on that to build your own competence. And then, of course, if you're open, if you're competitive and you're dynamic, it also makes you a more attractive place for foreign direct investment to come in. So those are all the reasons how trade openness can benefit you. But then we can also think about how trade can worsen shocks. We saw what happened with COVID. Supply chains are fragile. And when there are shutdowns or lockdowns in some countries, there's shock effects that reverberate across the supply chains. When firms decide to move, that creates disruption. There's layoffs, there's plant closures, there's tax implications. We all know that there's a lot of countries who are using subsidies and tax incentives to attract firms, and that is expensive, and it pulls resources away from other budget priorities. And it can become sort of a vicious cycle where you have to keep upping the ante to attract firms. So it's hard to keep doing that. And that can create more volatility. There's also concerns about becoming too dependent on a few sources of imports, especially food and energy. And we're seeing some of that now, looking at the US-China trade spat that we're having. Denying rare earth minerals is going to have an impact in lots of the high-tech production sectors. And, it's almost like weaponizing trade. And that creates a lot of instability. And of course, when you're open to trade and you build your export sources, you're vulnerable to downturns in their economies. And so it can negatively impact your own production, your own incomes. So being open exposes you to some vulnerabilities, but it can also create resilience. So there's just two sides to this coin. So let's just look back a little bit in history. Now, I wasn't born in the 1950s, and I'm sure most of you were not either. But that's really when things started to change with trade. So post-World War II, there was a concerted effort for countries to sit down and say, look, we've been at war for decades. We need to rebuild the global monetary system. We need to rebuild the global trade networks. And we need to repair the damage that was done in World War I and II, really. So the commitment by 23 countries that attended the first GATT conference at the Bretton Woods was to create those institutions. And so the institution was created to fix the global financial networks and deal with balance of trade and payments issues was the IMF. The institution that was created to help rebuild the war-torn economies was the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, or the World Bank. And then the third leg of the stool was supposed to be create the new trade agreements and be an institution that oversaw global trade agreements. And that was called the International Trade Organization. But the US would not let that. They rejected that. They did not, Congress did not want some global trade body telling us how to make trade policy. So we didn't have an institution, but we had the rules, the framework, the general agreement on tariffs and trade that was created. And that provided enough of a structure that the countries could sit down and negotiate trade agreements, right? And mostly it was focused on tariffs for decades. So as a result of that, what we saw was trade, volume and value rose dramatically, starting probably in the 70s was when globalization really started to take off. There was enough recovery from the war. And the changes were dramatic. I mean, many more countries were participating in trade. Tariffs were cut. It wasn't just developed countries, more emerging market countries were trading, not just north-south, meaning developed and less developed, but also tremendous increase in trade among emerging market countries, quite a bit more interregional trade. And then we also had this phenomenon of fragmentation, the global value chains. And that led to even more trade because now you had components and raw materials and semi-finished goods crossing borders multiple times as they were finished, as they converted from raw materials to a finished good. So this is just a picture of global merchandise export. So this is just goods. And you can see that it was not growing very much after the GATT talk started, but by 1972, 74, it was starting to increase. And if you look at the steep trajectory, really starting in 2000, that was when China joined the WTO. So there was a huge increase, a very steep increase in the rate at which exports climbed. And, you know, there's been some dips. You know, the financial crisis was the first big dip in 2008. Trump came in and there was, you know, recessions and slow recoveries from the financial crisis, the COVID years. But you can tell it's just a steady upward trajectory for the most part. This is services, not as long of open trade history, but also, you know, slow rise. And then since 2020, a much steeper rise. And some of that is because as countries get richer, they tend to consume and trade a lot more services than goods. It's just part of the development process. Okay, so besides the GATT, why else did trade take off this way? And there were really three reasons. The fall in the tariffs and trade barriers through the global multilateral trade talks. The introduction of the shipping containers that you see on the ships, the big boxes that are stacked up. It made it much more efficient and much cheaper to ship tons of goods over long distances. So that fall in transport costs was really important. There's a whole book on it written by an economist. And then technology change, you know, the email and cell phones and the use of wireless technology, all those things dramatically cut the cost of communication. You know, back in the 1980s, making a transatlantic phone call could cost $30 a minute. And now it's less, it's pennies. So the tech change for communication costs, the transport costs falling, and the trade barriers falling, it created this hyper-globalization phenomenon. You can really see it in the data starting in the mid-80s. And that's when we also started to see the spread of global value chains. That's what GVCs are. So in addition to the trade and transport costs and the tariffs falling, we saw a lot more countries realizing, and Indonesia was one of them, hey, let's unilaterally slash our tariffs. Let's create more regional trade agreements. And that led to countries saw the benefit of doing that because it made them more attractive for multinationals to locate parts of their supply chains. So that really took off starting in the 80s and 90s. Again, technology, tools, communication technologies, electronics just exploded and became so much cheaper and more available. So that also made it a lot easier to have different parts of the supply chain located in different time zones even, and you could still coordinate production. And then there was a lot of geopolitical and institutional changes that led to many countries that previously were very closed to opening. Of course, the fall of the Soviet Union and the opening of Eastern Europe, India's major reforms in the early 90s where they slashed their tariff barriers and got rid of a lot of the bureaucracy. China's opening up in the late 70s and the embrace of, markets. All those things led to this hyper-globalization. It really hit a fever pitch just before the financial crisis. And since then, the trade it's continued and recovered somewhat, but it's not the rate of increase that it was since 2008. Okay, so this is a picture of real growth rates in GDP. And all I want you to notice is the red line at the top. That is emerging market and developing countries. And notice that the growth rates for most countries, advanced economies, the emerging market, were pretty similar, moving in the same, but look at the big gap that opened up starting in the 2000s. And that was an astonishing achievement, I think, to have emerging market countries grow so much faster than the advanced economies. I mean, it's not surprising they grow faster anyway because they come from a lower base. But that growth, at that point in the mid-2000s, we were talking about income convergence, how emerging markets would catch up with advanced countries. Unfortunately, with the financial crisis and then the trade war in the mid-2000s or 20-teens and then COVID, that kind of growth wasn't sustained. But it was a remarkable period. And these are some of the ways, and you're well aware of these, how emerging market countries were connecting to global value chains. And different countries had different strategies. China was really focused on attracting FDI, creating a local partner that had to partner with the foreign firms so that you get technology transfer. And then they would build these supply chain cities that were just so efficient and really cut the cost. India focused much more on services and back office business processing and IT, and had, these workforce development trainings so that they could train people to do this work. Brazil had sort of it started with an import substitution model, but they were trying to bring in clusters of firms to form these really efficient production facilities and complexes and get the GVCs to come in and lead that. And Indonesia, more recently, has tried to upgrade the processing of nickel so that they're not just exporting the raw nickel, which is much more lower valued, but to be able to do more processed products that are higher valued and then build into, perhaps batteries and electric vehicles. So all those things create more income, higher wages, more productivity. So just a little bit about your history. I listened to this great Trade Talks podcast that had Mary Pangestu, who was your former Minister of Trade. She handled trade negotiations between 2004 and 2011. And it was great just to think about how trade dependent Indonesia has pretty much always been, but how some periods of your history you had great gains and then some backsliding, which isn't unusual for most countries. Policies change. But in the 1980s, there was this major customs reform where I think you got rid of your entire customs group and brought in a Swiss company to get rid of the corruption and make it work really well. And that led to a lot more trade and lower trade barriers. And you grew dramatically until probably the late 90s when the Asian financial crisis hit really hard, which, and that brought inflation and unemployment. And some of it was because you had opened your financial markets before you really had regulatory institutions that were strong enough to oversee it. And it was the IMF pushing this. And so I was glad to hear you're thinking about opening your capital markets now that you're stronger, you have better governance. But if you do it too soon, you pay the price. So what we also know is that there's times when if you're exporting raw materials like commodity products, coal and palm oil, you benefit when other countries are buying those and the prices go up. But it also pulls resources away from other sectors. And you can be overly dependent on that. I think Latin America's had a real hard time with that. But after your recovery from the Asian financial crisis, you were still very focused on commodity exports, but by the 2000s, you were trading in more intermediate goods. But according to this recent paper that I am citing here, and I'll be glad to share these resources, your global value chain participation has actually been falling. It's not been increasing. So trying to understand why that's happening and what's going on is probably an important part of thinking about your resilience going forward. And this is just, I see the legends hidden. No, it's up at the top. This is just a picture of your exports of your goods and services relative to GDP. Thailand is the orange bar on the top, and they have been increasing their participation in global value chains. So their exports as a share of the economy has been growing. Indonesia's peaked with the Asian financial crisis, and it's been ticking down since then. Some of that can be just because your GDP is increasing and maybe more of your growth comes from domestic consumption and investment. But interestingly, China has the same experience. Their export share of GDP peaked in 2006, just before the crisis, and it's been coming down. But some of theirs has been a concerted effort to focus more on investment and the role of the government. Okay, I'll make sure I'm not running too long here. This is just some data on who your top trading partners are. China, both for imports and exports, is number one. So you're very closely linked to China. Mostly you're exporting your commodity products, and mostly you're importing finished goods and electronics and machinery and equipment, things like that. The rest of your top trading partners are quite a bit further down in terms of the share in the US for exports, not imports. And then if you just look at what you tend to export, the exports are the first number, the imports are in parentheses. You're still pretty heavy in raw materials and intermediate goods and consumer goods. And it was interesting to see how many of your final consumer goods don't leave the country. A lot of it's home consumption. So trade's important, but it's not the biggest driver in your economy. So countries have tried to figure out the best way to grow with different strategies. And here's a list of several things that countries have tried to do. The import substituting industrialization happened sort of in the 50s and 60s. And to some extent, it still happens a bit. But that's where you're trying to close the borders and substitute away from imports and create your own domestic production. And it hasn't worked very well unless you're a country with a very big population, because most countries can't just be self-sufficient and generate enough income that way. They tend to have small, inefficient firms when they do that. China's model was to, require joint ventures and bring in new technology and other firms to pair with the Chinese firms, and that was very successful. Domestic content requirements are another way, but they tend to hold firms back over time, because if you require them to source, say, 50% of their components from inside the country, they may have much less sophistication, they may be more expensive. So that's usually frowned upon by the WTO. And, as was mentioned earlier, it's something Indonesia wants to move away from. When you ban exports of raw materials or put high tariffs on things, that can be a way to create more domestic production, give breathing room to spur these backward linkages, so more upstream vertical integration. Sometimes it makes it very expensive, so there's good and bad. The use of export processing zones to try to ring fence more trade and bring in more producers. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't, depends on transportation costs and logistics. And then just signing regional trade agreements and deeper agreements that get at problems with maybe antitrust or trade facilitation or investment agreements can help deepen your ties with your partners. And that can be successful, but there's no magic bullet. Usually it's a combination of strategies. So I'm just going to try to wrap this up so you can ask questions. The empirical evidence is pretty clear. If you open to trade, it usually is positively correlated with economic growth, but of course, not always. If you get very dependent on commodities and a lack of economic diversity, it usually hurts you, especially when you can't control the swings in those prices. Lowering tariffs on intermediate goods is always a good thing, because it helps increase your productivity and your choice of inputs. And one thing's really clear, it's not enough just to open. You also have to pay attention to, governance and rule of law and corruption and, protection of contracts and property rights. Those governance issues are really important. And then we know that countries that have more flexible markets, where resources can move from low to higher value more easily, tend to adapt better to shocks and tend to grow faster. And then we know countries that embrace export promotion have done better than those who tried to close the borders and grow from within. So, all right, I think I'm going to skip some of this just because I'm concerned it's taking too much time. I will be glad to share these. The tariffs that we're seeing now, tariffs are just trade taxes. We know mostly they tend to fall on consumers or the downstream users. We know tariff rates have been falling since the 60s. And we know most countries, when they impose tariffs, it tends to be on the import competing industries. So they're trying to protect the domestic firms. All these things are true. They distort prices. They hurt consumers. They can reduce the competitiveness of your exports, because exports and imports are really linked. A lot of imports are inputs into further production. And so they yield tariff revenue, but not if they're so high that they choke off imports. So why do governments use them if they can be so damaging? Well, if you ask President Trump, it's because trade is a zero-sum game, and we win and they lose. It's the mercantilist view of trade says that it's a zero-sum game, which all trade economists know is an absolute fable. It's a lie. Trade is mutually advantageous. So you can use trade taxes to generate revenue, but usually that's countries that lack the ability to tax income. So if you have a huge informal market and you can't trace income, this is an easy way to raise revenue. Sometimes it's to try to grow a new industry, build a manufacturing base. As long as you take the protection off in time, once the industry starts to grow and you face it with competition, it can work. But it can also lead to a lot of inefficiency. Industrial policy, backward integration, building in your supply chains. You can use it to retaliate against behavior by another government. We see that. Or to create more political pressure. Right now, what we're seeing is a lot of governments are using trade taxes and export restraints because they're saying we're worried about our national security, our ability to produce weapons and, you know, basic backbone industries like steel and aluminum and energy. But it's creating a lot of problems. The tensions we're seeing now, thanks to the trade war and the fallout from the Ukraine-Russia war, and the fact that many countries are trying to create industries in clean technology and, you know, batteries and electrified vehicles. The response has been to try to decouple since COVID. We want to make sure we are not dependent on countries that may be hostile to our interests. So the US and China are sort of codependent, but also at odds. And trying to shorten the supply chains so they're not so vulnerable to multiple points of failure. And that's where some countries are trying to reshore or nearshore, create more regional supply chains and not so far extended. And then de-risking is, firms can do this, but also governments. They're trying to change how the interdependent relationship exists. You know, build in buffer stocks or trying to diversify your suppliers, your customers, your transport routes, just to make it safer and less subject to, again, bottlenecks that can happen. I think Indonesia is an interesting case because you have the raw materials to make batteries or some of the most important raw materials, and trying to build a supply chain by upgrading your processing of those raw materials and then building batteries and eventually and you are attracting EV producers. But you're in a neighborhood where China's excess capacity is so large. There's a piece in The Economist just this week about, you know, this massive price war in China among the 115 EV producers. And now, because the domestic market's so saturated, they want to export. And Europe and the US, we all have EV producers that we're trying to promote, and it's just too many for the world to sustain. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens. We can't all sell an unlimited amount of EVs. So the trade cooperation has multiple forms, and I think it's important to think about all of them. I mean, yes, free trade agreements, trying to knock down tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers. Some of these broader, what we call plurilateral agreements, which are between groups of countries that find common interests and want to make more progress on deeper issues. It could be anything from antitrust to technology and data sharing agreements. Building in cooperation that guarantees emergency access to goods and services if there's disasters, you know, trying to help mitigate climate effects and having food stocks or having other emergency things available to help each other. I think that's really important. You know, just making trade easier and less cumbersome by digitizing all the customs processes, getting rid of the paper. The trade policy transparency is really important. Countries have to be clear on how they're using their trade policies and not make it so uncertain, which is the problem we're having now. And, making a commitment with your allies, and we need more allies, not less, not to do things like ban exports or restrain trade to help yourself. We call that a beggar thy neighbor policy. That kind of cooperation means that we want to focus on keeping trade open and clear and transparent, and not succumb to this dog eat dog. I'm going to just focus on what's best for me. I don't care how it affects you. And that's where having these trade agreements and these negotiating talks is so important. You just keep talking to each other. So the bottom line when we talk about resilience is uncertainty is really bad for it. It creates more volatility. And these are all the negative things that happen when you have more uncertainty. And it doesn't just hurt your economy, it hurts your trading partners. It hurts especially those at the bottom of the income distribution. They have the least ability to insure themselves or to mitigate risk. So there's something called a Trade Policy Uncertainty Index. It's based on US news sources, but it basically tracks the reference to uncertainty and fear. And you can see that it is just skyrocketing with Trump 2.0. And this just isn't good for anybody. And personally, as an American, I'm very sorry this is happening. All right. So if you're going to boost economic resilience with trade cooperation, of course, and you know this, you diversify your trade linkages. We commit to disaster risk reduction in our areas and our regions and to helping each other. Building your financial resilience so you're not too tied to any one country or any small group of countries with loans or sources of investment, because that's also risky. Trying to reduce trade costs, incorporating structural change that makes your economy work better. And then keep talking. We can reach agreements, perhaps in smaller groups. And this is something Indonesia's been good at, is in the RCEP and in your ASEAN agreements, you started small, but you kept working towards building on those trade agreements. And I think that is really the best way to boost all of our economic resilience. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Corey, for a very enlightening and insightful presentation. And we've got some points from your presentation, and then also we've got a comprehensive overview of the importance of economic resilience and how global trade and international cooperation influence each other in shaping the global economic landscape. Okay, to note some point from your presentation, I think you have explained that global trade cooperation strengthens economic resilience by helping countries diversify, innovate, and adapt to shocks. And also, you warn that over-reliance on trade or protectionist policies can increase risk and emphasize the need for smart and collaborative trade strategies to support long-term stability and growth, and economic growth, of course. And this presentation certainly sparks many questions and discussion. And therefore, I will immediately proceed to the most anticipated session, the Q&A session. Now, let's open the floor for questions from our audiences. And for participants who have a question, please feel free to type them in the chat box or use the raise hand feature to ask directly. We will select some of the questions to be answered by Corey. Okay, I think I see a hand over there. Yes, please go ahead, Ms. Elivia Astiwi Nur Azizah. Please, ask your question. We cannot hear your voice, but we can unmute it. Please unmute your.
Is she able to unmute herself?
Yeah. Can I hear either? Okay.
There we go.
Okay. Now we can hear your voice clearly. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Professor Krupp, for your insightful and timely presentation. It helped me better understand the complex relationship between global trade and economic resilience. I'm curious to know, in the current geopolitical climate, how can countries maintain economic resilience without becoming overly protectionist, while still engaging meaningfully in global trade and cooperation? And building on that, with the rise of regional trade blocs and shifting power dynamics upcoming, how can global cooperation be strengthened to avoid fragmentation while still ensuring inclusive growth and long-term resilience? Thank you.
That's a very important question that I think everyone wants to know the answer to. And I think one of the ways is to recommit to building the power back at the WTO. I think the WTO is the forum for really having global conversations about these geopolitical blocks that are forming. And I think there's a dangerous tendency to pull inward and want to just trade locally, but I think the world will suffer from that if it turns into a sort of you're either with China or you're with the US. Unfortunately, our political leaders are just going at it and ignoring this resource that we have. Restoring the appellate body, having dispute settlement work again. But, you know, there has to be a political will to do that. And both US and China have to be willing to respect the decisions and the rules. And so without that, I worry. I don't know how we can maintain growth and resilience if we ignore trade rules and the countries just keep escalating. I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for that.
It's quite awkward, right, for the answer. I think back to the Bretton Woods Conference, we have established actually 3 pillars of economic and trade institution, but yeah, WTO, one of the trade institution that have been built. Okay, the next question will go to Pak Widi Setiawan. Please, Pak Widi.
I think they have a hard time.
Okay.
There we go.
Now I can hear your voice. Okay.
Good morning, Corey. And first of all, I want to send greeting from MIDB students here. So we have a lot of students from many generations. First of all, and I would like to thank you for your appearance here. It's like medicine for us. Okay, we miss MIDB so much. So sometimes many countries like Indonesia use tax incentive to attract the FDI. Come on, go and invest in Indonesia. But sometimes we didn't think more about how we sell more to the world and how to increase the value added of our, for example, our mining product or something else. So in your opinion, which will be considered best for Indonesia? Is it increasing value added before selling it, before export it to the other country, or how we attract FDI from to Indonesia, which will be considered the best for Indonesia, in your opinion? Thank you.
I think it's not one or the other, Witty. I think it's important I think a strategy of not being overly dependent on raw commodity exports is important. I think some countries get trapped in that, especially when commodity prices are rising and income's coming in, and you can even have the we call it the resource curse, where it just keeps pulling more resources into those sectors and hollowing out other ones. So it's probably good to have a strategy to try to upgrade and go up the value chain. But you also have to diversify. So you can't just focus on upgrading raw commodity exports, but you also manufacturing more high productivity things, because mining, doesn't employ a lot of people. And if you're going to increase employment, you really need to diversify into services and manufacturing. I think it's hard because China is so big in so many industries and has such excess capacity that in the goods that you tend to produce, like textiles and footwear, I mean, China was such a big player there, and now it's Vietnam and Cambodia. It's just so challenging when you have such a mega trader like that. But it's still important to diversify. You do serve your own population. And, just making your economy more flexible and having domestic investment as well as attracting FDI. I think any more global value chains are not employing as many people as they used to, because technology change means they are much more capital intensive. So I think all countries are looking at the development strategy of bringing in value chains as it's not working like it used to. So it has to be a broad diversified strategy, not like just value up chain upgrading or just trying to attract FDI in manufacturing. It's got to be a broader diversified policy.
Thank you,
Okay.
Corey. Thank you.
Good to see you.
Thank
Good
you,
to see you.
Professor Corey, for your answer. Now, next question from Pak Simon Huta Barat.
Yes, can you hear me, Corey? And
Yes.
yes, thank you so much. It's been a while. I think it's 2012 back. I was contacting you to get into the MIDP, but I decided to go to University of Illinois. So, but it was a great conversations back then. So I think I have a questions. Actually, two questions. So first question is, you mentioned about the U.S. trade taxes that will be make the debt weight loss will be larger. So I think I know, and we all know that most taxes will be make a debt weight loss. So how we as a developing economies like Indonesia can cope with that kind of debt weight loss? We have a lot of taxes. We have import taxes. We have value added taxes, but we're not sure. I'm working for DGT, so we are still working on how we cope with this U.S. trade taxes, the import taxes, but we don't know how to so, quote unquote retaliate with this U.S. Trade wars. And my second question is, I think last week or maybe 2 weeks ago, President Trump and President Xi make a truce. There's a truce, but I'm not sure how that truce will affect developing economies like Indonesia. And I think U.S. Secretary Lutnick said, Trade Secretary Lutnick said that import taxes, tariff between China and United States will not be lower. It's something that we cannot probably see in the future. So how do you think with that kind of? I think that will be all, Professor Club. It's nice to see to understand how this kind of trade wars will impact developing economies, including Indonesia. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, it's like when two giants fight, all the little guys get trampled. And that's
exactly.
That's the worry. It seems that the agreement that Trump and Xi reached was really more about the rare earth minerals and about semiconductor chips. And they didn't talk too much about tariffs right now. what I'm hoping is that President Trump will get so much pushback from the American consumers when and if these reciprocal tariffs go into play, because it will raise prices dramatically. It's already starting to. And, you know, we came through the highest inflation we've had in 40, 50 years. And that's why President Biden was, I mean, the Democrats lost badly. So Americans and most people hate inflation. And so if it starts to rear its ugly head again, President Trump, I think, will back down quickly. Let's hope so. Let's hope he realizes how bad these tariffs are, because the economists, most economists, not the ones working for him, they seem to be reading from a completely different book, know how damaging they are and how many dead weight losses come from them. So that's what I'm hanging on for, is he's just going to be convinced by the pressure of the American public. I think Indonesia is a little bit more protected. The reciprocal tariffs he talked about weren't quite as high, and your exports are not so high. They're dependent on the US. Countries like Vietnam and Cambodia, they are going to be hit much harder because they're a lot more trade dependent on the US. So, but I'm just hoping those tariffs won't actually go into play, that it will lead to negotiations that knock down tariff and non-tariff barriers globally. But his rhetoric is really bad, though. Scary.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah.
Thank you. And now, Ms. Claudia Brigita, please ask your question.
So, good evening, Professor. So, I don't know if you realize or not, like the last few person who asked question is from the tax authority. So I think that's, like show how nervous our institution about the risk of declining the tax of review since last year and also this year. So I just want to ask a question, like from your experience, is there any tax policy that may be used by other country to manage to still raise the revenue without overburdening the lower and the middle income classes? Especially now we see that the middle class in Indonesia are actually declining in number. So that's also like one of the concern at the moment. So, but in general, I just want to ask if there's like any tax policy that probably gonna help us to raise the revenue. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a big concern. And actually, we have a tax expert now we've hired recently, Sebastian James, who spent nearly 30 years at the World Bank developing these micro simulation models to help countries look at this question. And they can apply different tax rates or tweak the types of taxes and try to understand how it affects revenue and, the different distribution of it. And I think we have a couple of new graduates coming back to Indonesia to work who just learned how to do this. So I'm not a tax expert. I do know that the US is one of the only countries that doesn't use a value-added tax. And there's a lot of economists who say that is really the best tax to use, as long as you pay attention to the regressive effects of it and offset it with lower income, people at the lower end of the income scale. But, anything you tax, you get less of. So when you tax savings, capital gains, investment, income, you incentivize, finding ways to earn income that isn't taxed, or to work less, or maybe not to work at all. And taxing consumption with, providing either tax relief at the lower end of the scale is seen as a very efficient way to collect revenue. But the distribution effects, you have to pay attention to those. So I'm gonna beg off because I'm not a tax expert and I don't want to say anything stupid.
Okay, thank you very much, Corey, for your clear answer, and also a question from Claudia. And I think we have one question from the chat box. Corey, if you don't mind. The question is, to what extent does the current structure of Indonesia's economy demonstrate resilience in the face of external shocks, including exchange rates and geopolitical uncertainties? Please, Corey. Okay.
Well, I know you have been very focused on trade agreements and doing especially regional trade, which does promote resilience. You have also been trying to shift away from being overly dependent on commodity exports and also on upgrading. That is positive for resilience. All the things that Ms. Rami talked about at the very beginning, it's very impressive, the focus that you have on the multiple things that you should be doing to build resilience that we talked about, the trade agreements, the structural change to try to improve the functioning of your economy. Those things are all building resilience. You can't wall yourself off from external shocks. None of us can. But focusing on, the long-term investments that build economic growth potential, educating your people, improving your political systems, paying attention to governance and, basic infrastructure things. Those are all important contributors. There's not much you can do about the fact that geopolitics intrudes all the time and that, sometimes this move towards more populist politics is frightening because it's moving away from a rules-based world that really built a lot of wealth and income over the years and led a lot of countries to really reduce their poverty rates. If it moves away from a rules-based system to a more power-based system, it will be hard on countries like Indonesia because as you are very big in Southeast Asia, but globally you're smaller. And so what I'm hoping is that we will continue to focus on trying to talk to each other and cooperate and not devolve into this power-based approach, because I think that can lead to conflict, and that's not what any of us want. With respect to exchange rates, I think moving away from a fixed exchange rate after the financial crisis is probably a good thing. It builds in, especially the more integrated you are with global trade, having a rigid exchange rate really can create a lot of problems. And you saw that. I think a lot of countries, yes, exchange rate volatility can also create instability, but not like it did with the financial crisis. And then you can focus your monetary policy on paying attention to what's going on with your own inflation, using it for your own domestic policies instead of using monetary policy only for your exchange rate. So, but I am not an Indonesian economic expert. You guys are. So I think you can answer that question better than I can, but I think you're paying attention to a lot of the right things.
Okay, thank you very much, Corey, for your answer. And I think since we have a very limited time for the Q&A session, so we have one last question from. Sorry, there are two questions from our audiences. I think the first one from Pak Agustinus Imam Saputra. Please be quick and then make your question into the pointer of your question. Thank you.
Good evening, Prof. Corey. I'm Agustinus from East Nusa Tenggara, Indonesia. Okay, I just want to pinpoint about the global trade and cooperation. I want to talk about the countries group or forum. Like we know the news, the latest news, Indonesia joined the BRICS and want to join the OECD as well. I want to know because I think this organization have different nature, vision or strategies. I think it can be collided since BRICS for the emerging country, OECD tend to the developed country. I want to know how the future of Indonesia. It's better if we join the BRICS or OECD for your perspective. And the second, I want to know about your opinion about Indonesia maybe have small impact, like you said before, some small influence, but we know that Indonesia have potential income from the carbon credit, and the West countries should aware that when they produce carbon emission, they have to trade off with carbon credit from country like Indonesia that has large forests that can minimize the carbon emission. They should pay because we maintain the environment, the natural resource of forest as well, such as forest and maybe plantation that we have in Indonesia. What do you think about if we use the proxy of the credit carbon that international countries should aware and pay more for Indonesian credit carbon? Thank you.
Thank
for
you
your
for your question.
enlightenment for us.
I think President Trump is not going to be on board with paying Indonesia for carbon credits. I think it is it's a legitimate strategy, and it was something that before President Trump came to power the second time was something. I think the carbon credit market itself had some fraud in it, so but I don't see this happening now. At least the US wouldn't support it, so not the US, President Trump. So the first part of your question about just the BRICS versus OECD, I think the BRICS formed as a counterweight to the US and the EU as being these big powers, and they wanted to make sure that their interests were heard, and they could achieve more of an equal weight or try to, like I said, counterbalance. I don't think it's an either or. I think there are certain things that are in Indonesia's interest that are more aligned with the OECD countries, rule of law, a rules-based trade system. The BRICS agenda may shift over time, and those countries that belong to it, Brazil, Russia, China, you may not all have a unified way of looking at the future and your own, the political choices that you make, your economic strategies. There's a lot of diversity in those countries. I think much more so than we see within the OECD. So I can't say you should pick one or the other. It really depends on the issues that you're interested in. It's probably good to have multiple memberships with different groups, because then you're talking to everybody, and you can build coalitions better that way than just choosing. I think we're in danger of splitting the world into groups and then figuring you have to choose one or the other. I think that is a dangerous way to go. It's probably better to keep talking to multiple groups and be a negotiator to cross the groups that are disagreeing. So, Merlin.
Yes, thank you, Corey, for your answer. Okay, I think last question from Bu Merlin Yunaniar, please.
Yes, hello, Corey.
Hi.
I'm so happy this morning here in Indonesia. I can hear your voice again. So I have quick questions, Cory, please. The first question, you have mentioned about financial resilience. I want you to elaborate more on the perspective of monetary policy. Nowadays, Indonesia and many countries face challenges. On one hand, there's a need to lower policy rates to stimulate growth, but on the other hand, inflationary pressures from tariff really impact us, and this is potentially looming for our economic and on the side of monetary policy. So my question is, what is the right balance that monetary authority can respond to this kind of situation? And then the second one, I want to get updates from you since our last lesson about WTO. So what is the recent role of WTO in the middle of the recent tariff and retaliation? Do they have power to prevent slow globalization as impact of tariff? Thank you.
Let me take that one first. I don't think they have the power to prevent it. I think they can keep trying to have cooler heads prevail, to keep the parties talking. It's interesting. I'm going to Geneva in 2 weeks to teach an international trade policy course as part of a Duke in Geneva program. And we have a visit at the WTO. And I was asking, can we hear from some people about how do you fix dispute settlements? How do you raise the profile of the WTO so people start to go back to it and trust it as a place to really work on these problems? And the answer was, we need to just focus on less controversial things with your group. I think they're still trying to figure it out. So I think they want to have a voice, but it's muted right now because the big guys are still battling. So with respect to monetary policy, the US is in the same position. We worry about inflation not being tamed yet. We haven't gotten inflation down to the 2% level that we want. And then with these tariffs threatening, you could see inflation take off and, cost push inflation build in. But at the same time, the labor market is softening. The stock market has weakened a bit. Housing prices are still high and the sales have started to come down. There's a lot of warning signs flashing that we could be headed towards a recession. But monetary policy is not your only tool. And you can, it's not just what's the exact right policy rate. It has to be a combination of monetary, fiscal policy, structural change, getting rid of, barriers and impediments in the economy. I think it can't just be, we'll lower the policy rate, see if that boosts the economy, and if inflation comes, we'll just jack it back up. It's just too volatile to do that. I think communicating to the public how important inflation vigilance is, because once it takes off, it's hard to kill it. And that's, I think, something we've learned post-COVID in a lot of countries. So.
Thank you, Cory. Unfortunately, since we have a very limited time, and that's all for the Q&A session, Cory. And once again, thank you very much, Cory, for your very clear and profound answers. And thank you as well to all participants for your enthusiasm and excellent questions. And before I end up this Q&A session, please, Cory, is there a few key takeaways you would like to address to our audiences? To summarize some of your presentation, yes, thank you.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed this time with you. I always tell my students, you have to, as a policymaker, and I've studied trade and economics my whole career. We don't have all the answers, and we have to be humble in the policies that we promulgate. Economies are very complex systems, and integrated global economies are complex to the nth degree. So there are no easy answers. There's no silver bullet. If I knew all those answers, I would be a very rich woman and I could just tell you how to fix everything. But I think there's fundamentals that we understand about economic resilience, and we've talked about a lot of them. And focusing on fixing things that you know are slowing your economy down or impeding resources moving to where they're more highly valued, or, you know, addressing issues with corruption or, you know, taxes that deter people doing, investing and working and trying new things, innovating. Those are the basics we know. And, you know, being open in trade and talking to each other. So I think trying to focus on the fundamentals is important, and not thinking there's just a magic answer out there, because there really isn't. So yeah, Indonesia has made great strides, your growth, your poverty reduction, you know, your economic diversification. I think you're really doing a lot of the things that are leading you to a better long-term future. And you certainly have a lot of really bright, motivated people. So I thank you for letting me have some time with you this morning, tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cory. So opening trade and eliminating probably any trade barriers, right, will be a good productive way for every country to support trade. Okay, thank you very much once again, Cory, very much for being with us. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big hand to Professor Cory. And also thank you once again for making our precious time with you, Professor Cory, with all of us today. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid that it is the end of our today's session with Professor Cory. And it will be useful to bear in mind that we as a policymakers should enhance economic resilience by diversifying trade partnership, commodities, and participation in global supply chains. While we are also reminded of the importance of global trade and cooperation as opportunities to build robust, adaptable economic systems. In today's agenda, we had some lively and interesting discussions and questions from the audience. Thank you for your active involvement and contribution. I would like to thank you, our speakers, once again for her time and expertise, and let's give them a big round of applause. And last but not least, I would like to thank the organizers and sponsor of this seminar for making this event possible. Please give them a hand as well. Again, thank you for being with us today. And I would like to give the screen back to our MC, Dea. Back to you, Dea.
Okay, thank you so much for Pak Uzi for smoothly moderating the session, and we really appreciate your time and contributions. And once again, we would like also to thank Professor Cory for the great presentation and deep discussion. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have had a fruitful discussion today, and now we come to the end of CommonQ Learning Week. As I mentioned in the opening, today is the last day of CommonQ Learning Week 2025. However, we are pleased to inform that our next agendas are Ideas Chamber on June 24 and Leaders Corner on June 26. So, please save the date and don't forget to join. Thank you so much to everyone who've joined us today. Before you leave, don't forget to fill out the evaluation form by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the link in the chat box. It will help us and you will get your certificate. Okay, that's a wrap for today. Stay healthy, everyone, and see you next year on CommonQ Learning Week 2026. I am Dea. Have a good day. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.